Thank you for joining us today for United Way of Metro Chicago's second State of the Social Safety Net virtual conversation. For those I haven't met, my name is Caitlin Klosser-Pert, and I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at United Way of Metro Chicago. Last month, we hosted our first virtual discussion, which took a closer look at how the government shutdown, increased federal immigration enforcement, and other challenges were impacting residents across Chicago, specifically regarding rising food insecurity. And while the height of that specific challenge at that specific time has passed, we recognize that there are still many other challenges facing the larger social safety net and our neighbors across the region. Each of us is experiencing the current moment in different ways, with some communities experiencing significant trauma, including some of United Way's neighborhood networks, and others already struggling to make ends meet. United Way is working with our partners to respond in a timely and relevant ways, and continuing our work to ensure individuals and families can meet their basic needs and neighborhoods are built stronger. This conversation series is one of the ways we are lifting up both the work that our partners are leading in neighborhoods across the region and the information that we are learning through 211 Metro Chicago. The needs arising from this data, alongside daily updates from our partners and information from news stories about potential changes to housing and urban development, or HUD, funding, led us to initiate this specific conversation to discuss how HUD's federal policy and funding changes, layered with numerous other challenges, are impacting housing for our neighbors, neighborhoods, and the social safety net across the Chicago region. We are honored to be engaging this conversation along with our three expert panelists. So first we have Angela Hurlock, who is the CEO of Claretian Associates, the lead partner agency in the South Chicago Neighborhood Network. She leads community development efforts that support 3,000 families annually in South Chicago, building on over 20 years of experience in affordable, sustainable housing. She also serves as board commissioner for the Chicago Housing Authority and recently served as their interim CEO. She's received numerous honors, including the South Chicago Chamber of Commerce Citizen of the Year and fellowships from Harvard University and the University of Chicago. She's also served on multiple boards and advisory committees within the housing and community development sectors. Next, we have Emily Krisciunas, who is the inaugural executive director of Chicago Funders Together to End Homelessness, a network of 40 philanthropic partners aligning efforts to prevent and end homelessness in the Chicago region. In her role, Emily facilitates funder learning and advocacy while leading grant making. Prior to this role, Emily served as Deputy Policy Director in the Chicago Mayor's Office, where she worked on issues related to housing and homelessness. Emily was appointed by Governor Pritzker in 2024 as co-chair of the Illinois Community Advisory Council on Homelessness. And last but not least, Tiff Beatty is the Associate Director of the National Public Housing Museum right here in Chicago, which is the nation's first cultural institution committed to preserving and interpreting the history of public housing and propelling housing as a human right. She received the 2022 Roberta or Bobby Raymond Leadership and Innovation Award from the Oak Park Regional Housing Center and was a 2022-2021 Senior Fellow with Chicago United for Equity, or CUE, and recipient of a 2019 Field Leader Award from Field Foundation of Illinois as a 2018-2019 CUE Fellow. Thank you all for being here with us today. I look forward to the conversation and discussing ways we can continue to be there for our neighbors across the region. And now I'd like to introduce Jackie Rosa, United Way's Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, who will be the moderator for today's conversation. Jackie leads United Way's public policy and programming efforts, plus the 211 Metro Chicago operations. She returned to United Way last year after serving as Deputy Mayor of Community Engagement for the Mayor's Office and is a member of the Leadership Greater Chicago's current cohort. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin, for that great introduction and overview. So hello, everyone. I'm Jackie Rosa, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at United Way of Metro Chicago. I want to thank our panelists for spending an hour with us this morning to discuss the important and timely topic regarding the state of housing and homelessness across our region. And I want to thank everyone in attendance, especially amid this hectic holiday end of year season. The fact that you're able to spend an hour with us today on this topic is also very important to the work that we all do. So we want to really learn more about real-time data and impacts directly affecting many of our neighbors, our families, our friends, and maybe even some of us on this call. As Caitlin mentioned, one of the most significant bodies of work within the Strategic Initiatives portfolio is 211 Metro Chicago. 211 is a free 24/7 confidential helpline that connects individuals to critical basic needs, services such as housing, food, healthcare, utility payment assistance, and so much more. The data coming out of 211 and what we're hearing from our partners, including some of you that are joining us today, tells us that individuals and families are struggling. And while the spike in food requests that we talked about in November has leveled off, times are still hard for many of us across our region. As we continue to navigate through a brutal Chicago winter, the need for affordable and safe housing is significant. Since launching 211 in 2023, our data has shown that finding and securing affordable housing to prevent homelessness is a leading need for individuals across Chicago. So I just want to go through some numbers here that we're looking at with our 211 data. So 59% of our calls from 211 are housing requests. There was a 64% increase in housing requests from 2023 to 2024, and then an additional 10% increase in calls from 2024 to 2025. Recognizing the significant need and an opportunity for providing efficiency to intake services, 211 Metro Chicago assumed the responsibility of the City of Chicago and Cook County housing lines in 2024. Since that time, there's been a 41% increase in housing-specific calls to 211. So what that data is telling us is that housing continues to be our number one requested service and the number one thing that Chicagoans, including in suburban Cook County, are looking for, which is, again, safe and affordable housing. While the Department of Housing and Urban Development rescinding its proposal funding shifts last week, it's important that we have this conversation today to examine the local impact limited affordable housing, homelessness, and potential decreased federal funding is having on our state and our Chicago region, and what we can all do to continue and support the social service safety net that our neighbors who rely on every single day have access to. So before we get into this conversation, I have a little bit of housekeeping. I want to remind folks that if you have questions, please submit them through our Q&A or chat feature. We will have somebody monitoring it. We will get to the Q&A portion from our audience at the end, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible given our time limitations. So with that, let's get started. So this question is going to actually be directed to Emily from Chicago Funders to End Homelessness. Really, Emily, would like to begin with you and want us to help us better understand what the current state of housing is and homelessness across the Chicago region and how individuals are being impacted directly by the results of either possible policy changes or funding shifts. So there's a lot of, I think, information being thrown at us right now. It's a never-ending news cycle. Changes are happening all the time. So if you could just kind of give us an overview of what you're hearing, what you're seeing, and really help dispel any misinformation that might be getting out to the general public.
Yeah, Jackie, thank you so much. And thank you to the United Way team for the invitation to be here. We're really lucky to have United Way be part of the Chicago Funders Together network and as a collaborator, and I'm happy to be here with Angela and Tiff. There was a really great WBEZ interview a couple of weeks ago with State Homelessness Chief Christine Haley and Mark Ishag from Thresholds. And in that interview, Mark talked about sort of already being in a moment of crisis related to affordable housing and homelessness in Chicago, and us really moving into catastrophe. And that stuck with me, like that line. We already have, by estimates of the Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness, 80,000 people in Chicago experiencing lots of different forms of homelessness in our shelters, outside, experiencing less visible forms of homelessness. And so that's already a crisis, especially, Jackie, to your point, as we move into really cold winter weather. And I think that a lot of us are feeling very concerned about what we're seeing out of the federal government in terms of funding cuts and policy shifts. And you mentioned, I think, probably the biggest thing that folks are feeling worried about right now, which is that HUD manages this $4 billion really crucial program called the Continuum of Care Program, the COC program, which awards grants to communities all over the country to end homelessness. And for decades, those resources have really been able to prioritize permanent housing for people who had been experiencing homelessness, which is so crucial. The region, Chicago and suburban Cook County, get around $150 million that houses thousands and thousands of people and families and children. And in the middle of November, HUD released some really significant and devastating changes to that funding program that could have an impact on as many as 5,000 households in Chicago losing their housing in early 2026, and closer to 8,000 households across the entire state losing their housing. And those shifts are really about sort of moving away from what we know works to end homelessness, like moving away from evidence-based best practices like housing first, and moving to more time-limited housing, toward work requirements, toward mandatory services, institutionalization, immigration enforcement, really damaging things that will impact Chicagoans and their families. And also, I think it's important to note that there's a ripple effect. Like, not only are we worried about potentially like a 60 to 70% cut locally in that federal funding, but we know that when households lose their housing, there is a ripple effect on so many other parts of the safety net, right? It impacts the organizations and the staff of those organizations that provide housing and services. It impacts landlords in many cases, like small mom and pop landlords who use those rental subsidies to cover their own expenses. And we're really worried that the ripple effect on emergency rooms, on our already strained emergency shelter system, will really be pretty catastrophic as we move into 2026. Also important to note that there's a hearing right now in the lawsuits brought against HUD related to these changes. So we're sort of bracing ourselves for the outcome of that and hoping that maybe these changes won't stick, but preparing as if they will.
And Emily, thank you for calling or naming housing first, right, as a strategy for so many of the ripple effects that we're seeing in the social safety net. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the housing first strategy or model? Because I think it's really important to set the stage for how so many of us experience the social safety net, especially here in Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, Housing First has enjoyed several decades of sort of bipartisan support as the understood evidence-based, research-based best practice for how you end homelessness, which is that first and foremost, you address a person's housing needs, right? Like without judgment, without lots of stringent requirements, that first and foremost, like in the way that I get to sit in here in my warm home, that you first address a person's, sort of stabilize a person's housing at the same time that you're providing lots of rich supportive services to that person. So it's not sort of housing alone, but it is housing first, coupled with other supportive services. And I think that what we're seeing from a policy perspective at the federal level right now is really this shift away from acknowledging homelessness as first and foremost a housing problem, and really instead, to your point about kind of misunderstandings about the root causes of homelessness, which is a housing problem, and instead really pushing these myths that it's a mental health problem or it's a substance abuse problem, and trying to push people toward those kinds of mandatory services, when really what we know the evidence tells us is that when you stabilize a person's housing first, we'll see positive outcomes across other aspects of their life.
Absolutely. Thank you. Super important. So I want to, this is actually a perfect segue for Angela. So Angela, in addition to serving as the CEO of Claretian, you serve on the board of the Chicago Housing Authority. Can you help us paint a picture around the housing needs that you see around the city, but specifically in South Chicago, where your organization is based?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Again, also thank you to United Way for just creating this platform for us to talk a little bit about this work. So across the city, in my role as a commissioner for Chicago Housing Authority, just to paint a picture, Chicago Housing Authority assists 63,000 families across the city limits to stay housed. And 43,000 of those families are using a housing voucher. The difference between those two is that a housing voucher could be someone who's living next door to you. You don't even know how they're paying their rent, right? Like they're using that voucher to support them staying in that unit. And just as Emily hinted towards,
any kind of obstruction in the loss of vouchers or the diminishing of vouchers, it not only affects that family from staying housed, it affects the landlords. It affects those auxiliary types of industries that are supported by housing in alone, whether it's landscaping, contracting, exterminating, whatever those are. So it's a support to the private market. And so it is working in tandem, so to speak. So 43,000 families are actually receiving some assistance through the housing voucher. And then the rest of the families are in what we would traditionally call, public housing supports. And 99% of our funding, of our over $1 billion funding comes from HUD. So they are supporting us to be able to support the families here in Chicago. But those families are families that are working. Those families have children that are going to school. Without that housing, that really does cut down on their livelihood. Bringing it down to kind of a community focus, South Chicago itself. So I've been fortunate to be the CEO here at Claretian Associates it'll be 22 years next month. So I'm able to kind of take a long historical look at how housing has changed. The first year that I was here, 2004, we brought a building online that was 6 flat units. So it's 29 units total with an on-site property management office. So let's call it 30 units. 30 units. In the first month we opened that building, we had 1,000 families apply to get into those apartments. That speaks to the critical need of people who are in need of housing. But even today, housing is still very, very much needed. Without those 4 walls of safety, you can't think about where you want to work. You can't think about how your kids go to school, all those types of things. And so community development corporations like Claretian Associates not only work in the housing space, but we've evolved over time to understand that we have to work in other spaces to support those families. We first have to house those families, but then 2, how are those families working? Are they underemployed? Not unemployed completely, but underemployed, meaning that sometimes it takes 2 or 3 adults working full-time jobs to be able to cover the rent, and they're still struggling to cover all of those other things that need to happen. Food, medicine, recreational things. And so we've seen families that have stayed with us, moved in with us, and lived with us for years. The property that I mentioned earlier, where it was 29 units and 1,000 families applied, I know at least 3 of those families that moved in, never moved out. They lived there for 20 years. They've been able to see their children grow up. We've been able to help them do other things like go on to have better employment, because now housing is not an issue. They can work on school. They can work on building a skill set. They can work on getting better jobs. We've seen people go on to buy their own homes or go on to be benefit from unsubsidized housing, right? Because they're able to actually afford a unit that's in the regular market, the unsubsidized market, I would say. And so those are ways that we're seeing that housing stabilizes everything else. It really is we call a social determinant of health. You can't be healthy if you don't have a place, 4 walls, safe walls to call your own. And for us, that has leveraged us into other areas of the working in the community, like safety, understanding that people who live in homes also need to be able to walk the street safely, right? So we've moved into working in safe passages and other street intervention that allows our community to be safe. But it's also helped us to leverage working with local schools to make sure that our children have their supports that they need so they can grow up and become citizens that are giving back to the community, and they haven't been traumatized by the instability of having housing that isn't stable.
Yeah, no, thank you, Angela. And I think that, I grew up in Chicago, right? And I always think about so much of the community that is built around public housing. And growing up, there was this myth of like, oh, you don't want to go near the projects or you don't want to go near public housing. But it's like, I know so many kids that went to grammar school with me that came from those housing, and guess what? They were thriving in school because they had a community of neighbors that they could call on that were like family members, because there is that sort of, to your point, right? It's this housing model that builds community, that helps people with so many other issues that they may be facing at the same time. So I think this is a really, again, testament of how important public housing is and why CHA has such a long legacy and history here in Chicago. And so to that note, I want to hand it over to Tiff, who is the Associate Director at the National Public Housing Museum, which is just so phenomenal, that is based here in Chicago. If folks have not gone, please go, do yourself a favor. It is an amazing, amazing museum, and just tells, again, the rich history of how public housing, but specifically public housing here in Chicago. So Tiff, I want to take a step back and again talk about the knowledge that you have from the nation's history when it comes to public housing. Can you provide an overview of how public housing has shaped not just the nation's housing story, but some of the policies pertaining to public housing that are impacting Chicago residents? And how do we preserve that story?
Thank you so much, Jackie and Emily and Angela. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you also for bearing with me, everyone in the room, with my technical difficulties. As you can see, I'm on my phone, and of course, I did not charge the battery, so I'm going to hold it here. But and I also appreciate that the transition. I'll just say, it's a grim reality that we're living in, but that hasn't been something that I think is a news story for a lot of people in this country. I think there has been, a lot of these challenges for a really, really long time, and I'm coming into this story, at this point through the National Public Housing Museum, but I also think, having that long view of history is really important to understand, where our country started and the different waves of social movements that we've been through, and how we got to this point, right? As we're reflecting back, and the way that we do that, the National Public Housing Museum is really learning these lessons and sharing these lessons. And so it's not just about reflecting back on history and preserving it, but it's really about those lessons from history that can inform the work that we're doing today and how we relate to each other and how we respond to this moment. So that's both, again, this personal history, it's familial history, it's community history, and it's also national and global history. And so I think it's important also that I say, personally, I do have a personal relationship to this topic. I'm not originally from Chicago, but I did grow up in Tacoma, Washington. And I used to say, as I was sort of discovering and reflecting back on my own housing journey, that I lived in 22 different places by the time I was 21. That includes homes, but also apartments and motels and family and friends, and eventually going to college and then moving here to Chicago, where I lived in Hyde Park, moved around maybe 7 different apartments in Hyde Park, before eventually almost every apartment I applied for was owned by Mac Properties, and I could not afford the rent. And so moved north and a little bit west to Bronzeville. So now, my relationship with Bronzeville has me reflecting on public housing history in a different way. And so it's through reflecting on my own personal story and also some of the people that I met here in Chicago when I first moved here, a woman by the name of Beatty Turner, who was a housing activist in the late 90s and early 2000s, but really started as a writer and what she would call a writer and a fighter and a voice for the voiceless. Just a radiant woman who really was passionate about her community, raising her children in public housing in Robert Taylor specifically, where she became a resident journalist, and also a docent or a tour guide for being an ambassador to folks from outside of public housing to introduce them to public housing residents and apartments. So as a young sort of fresh out of college student, I was able to go on one of these ghetto bus tours, as she called them, in which ghetto is an acronym for the greatest history ever told to our people. And so I wrote a poem about Beatty Turner about a decade later, actually, just through my poetry practice, reflecting on my history and also how I got to Bronzeville and the people like Beatty who came before me and the buildings that no longer exist and all of the vacant land. And that was really an impactful experience that led me to, like I said, writing this poem, and ultimately led me to the National Public Housing Museum. So it was through through my Chicago United for Equity fellowship that I was invited to the National Public Housing Museum before we had a building. So we were in office, or they were in office in River North. And they were insistent at the time that they were a museum, even though there was just this little exhibit and a few objects. But the objects, even at that point, were just so powerful, and especially because they came with these labels that were actually written by the residents themselves. So it was through that experience with connecting with the community there at the National Public Housing Museum, seeing the objects and learning that there were different ways to build a museum to really reflect not just sort of a curator's idea of how to represent a history or a historian's tale of what happened, but really centering those first person narratives. So those objects and also the oral histories that the museum is dedicated to collecting, it really impacted me. So thinking about first person narratives, as well as connecting and creating space for different stakeholders to come together. So public housing residents, absolutely, people who have lived in public housing, but also people who maybe could have benefited from public housing, but remained on the wait list too long and never actually were able to take advantage of this public good. And so, and that the conversation we're having about how housing is tied to all of these other public goods, is also very important. I'm also, proud product of public schools, and I love public parks, and couldn't have gotten here without the public health services. And so I think the more that we can help people understand that this conversation about public housing is about this really the broader idea of a social safety net, as you all are saying, but also just the community, the society that we want to live in is not a society where we all are individuals and that we can't count on each other, because eventually we may not consider ourselves low income, but it's coming for us too. Those of us who have supposedly made it, none of us are safe in this society from I think some of these forces that we really have to be fortified against, and that takes shared values of, like I said, centering the people with the lived experience to be able to tell their own story, but also creating this social foundation for having these conversations and coming together, listening to each other's stories, and really understanding how we got here as individuals and as communities. So that's really a lot of the work that we do here. It's through the lens of housing. We are fighting for housing as a human right. We are interested in building those relationships with folks that are doing this work. But we also see that as a very broad set of stakeholders, and that's really includes all of us. But we, in particular, love working with artists who can make these things more accessible and legible and inspiring. As a poet, I connect to quotes like Tony K. Bambara, who says that the job of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And I do think we're in one of those moments where we have to think about, how do we create revolution that people can feel excited and interested in being a part of? Because I think that the direction that some people want to take the society in is not the society that most of us really are interested in building, which is safe, quality, livable communities that we can all thrive in. So that's the work that we do. And yeah, this has just been really exciting to connect with you all, because I think there's just a really it's a tough moment, but again, I see a lot of potential. I see public housing residents in particular continue to gather and connect, and the communities are still very vibrant. There's still picnics, and there's still parties, and there's still folks who come even to our space to host birthday parties and celebrations, community celebrations. And so we know that there is a lot of stories to tell around public housing. We're just really excited that now we have a space to tell them, and for folks to come gather and to just to build a future for housing.
Thanks, Tiff. And Tiff, could you, for those that have not been to the museum yet, and one of the things I really loved about it is that it's actually the site of public house. It used to be public housing right on Taylor Street. So Tiff, if you could talk a little bit about that building itself, and what I really loved was the replica apartments of residents that used to live there, including some famous people, which I thought was a really great touch.
Yeah. So we put the famous people right next to the everyday people, and that's that's the history of our communities, right? We had Chicago in particular has a lot of claim to fame, but also people that are just everyday people that are really cool and have interesting history. So yeah, right around the same time that I talked about Beatty Turner and Robert Taylor here in Bronzeville was organizing. There was also efforts happening on the near west side in the ABLA community. So those that are less familiar, the ABLA is a collection of public housing complexes. So it includes Jane Addams Homes, which is actually the building that our museum is built in. So it is one of the 32 buildings in that neighborhood that was saved by Commissioner DeVere Beverly and other residents in that area who basically saw, during the plan for transformation that their homes were being demolished and that this history and their experiences, their stories were no longer going to be visible and were frankly in danger of erasure because as we know, the way that the history books end up getting written, like if you don't insist that your stories are told, folks from marginalized communities, the chance that they won't be or they'll be misrepresented. And so she was very clear that this needed to be a resident-led effort, but that it was going to take a lot of work and collaboration. So she actually and other residents went to Sonny Fisher, who was then the head of the Driehaus Foundation, which is a preservation foundation, which continues today doing this work in partnership with the museum and others to really try to figure out how to turn this building that looked nothing like a museum into a museum. And it took, almost 2 decades and, several million, I think $16 million, and really a lot of narrative change. There was a lot of skepticism and really just like confusion around why there would be a museum to public housing. But I think today, as folks come in, I even talk to people that are skeptical and they're like, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if this was a good thing, if we should be having a museum like this. But then once they come in and they see, things like the historic apartments, which were actually inspired by, if anyone's been to the Tenement Museum, in New York. So actually a group of residents went to New York and actually visited the Tenement Museum, which is basically, recreated tenements. And so we basically took that same approach where we worked with, and I say we in the broader sense, this wasn't me directly, but folks from the staff were interviewing people who had lived in the building all the way from the early days of when it first opened in 1938. So the first family apartment that you visit when you go through this, we call it a historic portal, is the Turovitz family, which was a Jewish family. And so they were one of the first families to live in the apartments. And, that was some of the early days when, public housing was not actually, predominantly Black. And there were, it was very diverse. And in this particular community, Jane Addams, it was also segregated, but there was, many white families, whether it's Jewish, Italian, other European immigrants. And so, we tell that story all the way through some of the policy changes and some of the real estate practices that impacted Black communities in particular and ended up leading to public housing becoming predominantly Black. And so the story ends with the Hatch family, which I would say is a Chicago famous family, to be honest, like all the work that they've really done here in the community. But also they have a famous relative who voices the tour in the third apartment, who is Lil Rel Howery. So if you've seen Get Out or some of he had his own TV show. He's a very successful comedian, but he takes a really great approach to telling the story because he interweaves humor, but he also has a very reverence and respect because it's his family story. And so he's coming into the story sort of in the 60s and 70s and really just talking about his family story, but also Dr. King being in Chicago, organizing for housing and civil rights, and just making all of that history come to life. And so I definitely recommend. I don't want to give away too much. Hopefully you all are intrigued and not feel like now been there, done that. But I really do, from everything from the actual objects to the docents to some of the immersive creative ways that the stories are told. I really do recommend the experience. And yeah, just come and check out the museum as a whole, but definitely the historic apartments.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I think that that is a great segue for our next question, or really for you all to share. So, Chicago is very collaborative in its nature of approaching the work, right? So we collaborate in community, we collaborate with our funders, we collaborate with organizations, and now we're collaborating with national museums. And so to that, I want to really redirect these next questions to Angela and Emily. And I would love to hear from you all some of the collaborative work that you're doing to address so many of the complex challenges when it comes to housing, because I think housing is a very layered thing. It's a very layered approach, right? Angela, as you shared earlier, it's not just about giving someone a physical home to live in, but it's also the services and the workforce that goes with being able to maintain that home and being able to maintain the affordability of it all. So would love, Emily, to direct it back to you to talk about some of the collaborative work that Chicago Funders to End Homelessness is doing to help solve these big complex issues. And then Angela, would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I've worked on the issue of ending homelessness for the better part of 15 years, and I have done it in philanthropy in my current role. I did it most recently when I worked for the city of Chicago. I worked in the nonprofit space, and to your point, it really does takes all sectors coming together to address such a complex issue. And Tiff, I really appreciate the reminder that it also takes, right, the sort of artists and poets and sort of the role that art plays in some of the narrative work that we know is necessary to address homelessness and advance housing justice too. So thank you for bringing that in. Chicago Funders Together is really focused on helping bring together philanthropic partners who have similar goals around increasing access to housing. And the idea is that if you bring those funders together and they build relationships with each other and they meet with each other and they learn with each other and they share with each other what they're focusing their grant making on, the outcomes will be better, and there will be this multiplying effect related to their giving. And especially if you have philanthropic partners that work really closely with local and state governments, then you can look for places where maybe flexible funding from philanthropy, that's going to be the smaller piece of the pie, can do interesting or innovative things, or maybe unlock pieces of government funding in an interesting way. I think we feel particularly proud of some of the ways that we've collaborated together just over the last couple of months. So maybe I can highlight that before kicking it over to Angela. Chicago Funders Together has pooled and awarded about $1.5 million just in the last few months in response to what we're seeing at the federal government level. So we've used responsive grant making dollars to do a few different things. We've done small capacity building grants to about 60 of the region's housing providers who have needed, for instance, to get on the phone with an attorney or do some contingency planning or are looking for ways to appreciate their staff. So we've directed support through our pooled funds to those kinds of partners. We've also created these sort of flexible pools of resources for our Chicago and suburban Cook continuums of care that can help resolve a person or household's housing crises quickly with cash, so that they're not entering the homelessness system or the shelter system in the first place, and kind of decreasing pressure on those systems. We've also really tried to invest in advocacy and community organizing, and Tiff, to your earlier point, narrative change work. That feels so important and foundational to helping address some of the myths and misconceptions, Jackie, that you alluded to earlier, that I think are being really perpetuated by this particular administration. And so I think that collaboration creates infrastructure for funders to do things quickly together and to really maximize their impact. And that's very much at the heart of the way that CFTH works.
Thank you, and I'll jump in. I just to speak about, collaboration. I think that when everyone can bring their best to the table, that's when great work happens, right? And so Claretian Associates historically has been working in the collective impact space, where we're a backbone agency and we're able to bring in resources and spread them around to other groups that we're working with on a variety of different things. Whereas we are a housing provider, we also work in the safety space, the mental health space, a variety of different things that, you know, housing providers aren't necessarily seen as working in, but because we have great partnerships, that's what allows us to be able to do that. Of late, one of the partnerships that we've just been working in is the creation of our new quality of life plan that'll be revealed in 2026. January 31st is our great reveal date. And so we've been able to bring together over 40 partners to look at the quality of life in South Chicago and bring a comprehensive resident-driven plan together that works on 7 pillars that will help our neighborhood be a neighborhood of choice and not one of last resort. And of course, there are things like housing and safety and education and employment. And those are the things that are going to make sure that our residents are taken care of, our seniors, our families, our youth, and that they live strong, vital lives full of abundance, and not lives that are plagued by this idea of scarcity, right? Like we run around thinking that there's just not enough of the pie. Well, there actually is enough of the pie. We just have to work together to make sure everyone does get a piece of it. And so we're really excited about the quality of life plan and how it's going to really give us a blueprint for how we can work together from all spheres of the neighborhood to be able to improve the quality of life in South Chicago. And so super excited about that coming on board.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna go a little off script. Hopefully United Way doesn't kill me. They won't, they love me. So I, as a Chicagoan, right, my entire life, all I've been hearing is Chicago's too expensive. People can't afford the rent, and obviously we're not at the point of New York, but I would say we're getting closer. And then you drive by neighborhoods and you see vacant lots and vacant properties. And it's just such a mind shift to go from, you have these neighborhoods that are charging $2,000 for a studio, and then you have communities where you're driving by and there's a bunch of vacant lots and vacant apartments. And I feel like this has been going on for so long. So from you all that have, either worked in this space or lived in Chicago, what would you say why is that such a challenge? Why can't Chicago be affordable for everyone? And why can't we really think about, I know we're doing hyper local work in so many communities to ensure that there's investment in them, but why has this been going on for so long? I feel like the entirety of my life, this has been a challenge. So I know it's kind of a little spicy question, but I think that it's important that we all have this conversation, especially given the moment we are nationally.
Yeah. If I may jump in.
Yes, please.
I would say first and foremost, I think that how we think about housing has to change and evolve and be flexible. The dream, right? The American dream is everyone gets a single family home. That is not necessarily what should happen. Density brings about the ability to lower the cost of housing. So if you're able to have multifamily units, that is very, very helpful. There are some that will have single family homes, some that will have 2 flats, 4 flats, and some that will live in buildings that are 10s, 80s, 100 units in the building, because that lowers the price. And I think being able to look at each neighborhood and see what works best really will work for Chicago. In South Chicago, we have a lot of multi-units, and we have some single family homes, but a lot of multi-units. And I think in the affordable housing space, we tend to think that the greater the density, the greater the ability for us to benefit from affordability. It also allows us to serve as many people as once at one time and be able to bring in as many resources as possible. We have a lot of vacant land in South Chicago. Our history is steel mills. And so when that kind of went away in the early 1980s. A lot of families left. A lot of the housing was worker housing, and it was not necessarily quality housing, which left a remainder of a lot of vacant lots. We try to see that as an asset, so that as we're building homes, whether it's multifamily or single family, we give lots of space for kids to run around, to be outside, to experience, for families to grow into, and those types of things. I think we have to look at a variety of different ways. It's not one size fit all, but look at a variety of ways that housing can be provided in Chicago. And we'll find a mix that can work, because also affordability is a misnomer. What's affordable to you isn't affordable to me. And so, but if we can have these mixed income, mixed unit type of neighborhoods, I think that's where we really get the vibrancy and we see the resiliency that we are as a human race.
Awesome. Thank you. I knew you were going to be the first one to answer that question, Angela, because you probably think about that every single day. I'm going to hand it over to Emily to also give her thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that came to mind were some of the narrative pieces that Tiff was alluding to. Like, it just made me think about conversations that I have all the time in my role with executive directors who, are trying to create housing options, to Angela's point, with a range of affordability options, and the resistance that those organizations so often meet from community members. And I'm thinking especially in like parts of the city that I live in, Lincoln Square, like the opposition from community members, from neighbors, sometimes from alder people, like I think, and sort of the misconceptions about it, sort of not seeing affordable housing as a deep asset, of mixed income housing as a deep asset, as often beautiful assets in a neighborhood. And so I think that there is narrative work that has to happen to sort of change the kinds of conversations that we have in neighborhoods, to embrace different kinds of housing options for people. And I think that that's part of why we think that investing in community organizing is so important, because they're doing that education with neighbors and with older people to try to expand affordability across the entire city.
Awesome, thank you. And then Tiff, I'll hand it off to you to answer this question as well. And then we have one question from our audience, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add besides what Angela and Emily said, but I do think about this, as I was talking about. I live in Brownsville. I live in one of those neighborhoods that still has a lot of vacant lots. I do see a lot of I wouldn't say a lot, but more single family homes being built since I moved to this neighborhood in 2015 than maybe was the rate prior to that. And I think, there's a lot of different factors. But yeah, it's been slower in this community than I think people anticipated. And Natalie Moore has written about this. A lot of people have written about just this neighborhood in particular, and also just the ways that these patterns have unfolded. I can say it much more articulate than me, but I do go back to some of these foundational questions. I guess it's just sort of the poet in me that just thinks about these things in this way. But yeah, I mean, I think about the framework for how we're building this and how that determines a lot of the possibilities that we see. So, I'm in some of these conversations, in some ways I feel like more of an observer, but just hearing the conversation around how to fund housing, and you have to be creative, right? To think about, how do you build in some cases, housing authorities are creating not-for-profits so they can get money, and they're like sharing decision-making power, public and private partnerships, just to try to get the housing, just to make it happen. Really is the bottom line. Is that we need more housing, however we have to do it, and I respect that. At the same time, I do wonder how much compromise can we make within this system. Have we given up on this idea of public housing? And I hear a lot more of the conversation around affordable housing, and for some folks, it's just the goal of it being temporary is not necessarily something that can happen. Just like with Angela saying, I totally agree that like single family home for everyone is not necessarily what we should be aspiring to. I think there are different models that we need to expand our vision a little bit more of what community and what successful communities look like, and how we're defining success. And so I think that just to be frank, that right now public housing and government subsidized housing is within this capitalist model that I question, you know, how close can we get to housing as a human right, or housing for everyone, housing for all, these kinds of statements that we are insisting are true, if we're just steady trying to figure out how we can compete in the private market and move at the speed of the market, and all these things that, you know, are being said with a lot of gravity, because they're real. And so I'm just, you know, sort of thinking through some of that and trying to reflect on what I'm seeing is like, you know, in some ways it's just, as a community, we have to come together and ask these questions and push our alder people, and push, you know, the federal government, push at every level, even each other, holding each other accountable for some of these ideas that are entrenched in us about what successful communities look like, and how we build them.
Okay, so we need a part 2. You guys just brought up, I was looking at the time, I'm like, we have like 6 minutes left, and you all just brought up some like amazing points right now. So this is definitely like a multi-layered part 2 that we're gonna have to have. Maybe we'll have it off screen so we could be a little bit more but yes. So what I'm hearing here is narrative change. What I'm hearing is community organizing, and what I'm hearing is really preserving public housing, right? Like, it's not a one size fits all model, and we know that this is possible because it's been done. And so I think we're at a moment right now where we really have to hold everybody accountable to say, either we want to eradicate homelessness and we want to give people the correct quality of life, or we don't. And I think that's kind of where we're drawing the line in the sand. And I thank you all for making it clear where you all stand. But before we get off, we do have 2 questions here, and they are a little bit, so we might have to do some follow-up per email. But we do have a question, Angela, around the quantum project that's coming to the southeast side, where used to be the old steel mills that you spoke about earlier. How is that going to impact the community, especially around housing? So I know it's a pretty kind of a long question, but if you can kind of give a little bit of information on that. And then we have another question around density. So I'll let Angela answer that one first.
I'll try to be real quick, and I want to definitely thank longtime colleague Dina Al-Khatib for sending that email in. So if you think about the fact that the steel mills at its height employed 20,000 people, and to have that type of economic engine evaporate from a community, the results of what we see now in our community is part of that. So now we have quantum coming in, and they're going to bring a brand new type of industry to not only this neighborhood, but to the entire country, right? It is the first quantum computing facility that'll be built. There are great opportunities there. There's great opportunities for not only innovation in just that industry, but for jobs for our community, for people not only that live here, but then of course there will also be people that move in. There's opportunities for new types of housing, but also for businesses to thrive that have been here, and businesses that people want to actually see themselves in that are coming. And so we find our spaces, how do we leverage that? How do we make sure that the residents that are here are not inadvertently pushed out through gentrification, are not left out through inabilities to get the jobs that are coming, and that they can see themselves in these types of positions, or even in businesses, running businesses that are feeder businesses for what is to come. Because if you have that amount of people that are going to be in the neighborhood, whether they're living or coming, where do they eat? Where do they shop? Where do they spend their leisure time? Where there's all types of opportunity for our residents in our community to benefit. And so we have to leverage that. And so part of the quality of life plan actually talks about that. It's not the entirety, but part of it does talk about workforce development, and how do we make sure small businesses are strengthened, and how do we make sure residents are ready to partake of that type of industry and continue to thrive.
Awesome. Thank you, Angela. And then this last question, I'm actually going to hand it over to Emily, because I think you kind of alluded to this already. But, you know, there's a lot of pushback due to fear of higher density housing, and what will it do to a neighborhood in terms of, you know, the bringing the values down of other properties. And so I think that's something that, you know, we continue to see in neighborhoods, specifically on the north side of Chicago, right, where gentrification is very prevalent, and where folks feel like this idea of, oh, no, you can't bring public housing here because, you know, my property value will go down. So Emily, could you speak a little bit to that, and kind of what are the things that Chicago Funders End Homelessness are doing around this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the examples of some advocacy work that we've been really proud to support is work that, for instance, Palenque LSNA has advanced around the Northwest Side Preservation Ordinance, and like these opportunities to think about ways to like maintain smaller properties, 2 and 4 flat properties, and be able to just keep people affordably in them and not have them replaced either by single family homes or by higher density properties. And that's something that feels really important. Tiff and Angela, welcome. I know that we don't have a lot of time, but I'm also thinking that you both might have perspective on this question if you want to get anything in before we wrap up.
Nothing in addition. I think what you shared was great.
Well, we are at time, and I feel like we were just getting started, but I want to thank you all for being on this call today. We might need to do a in-person part 2 because I think again, we keep saying this. I think all of you all have been saying this, people on the call, like Chicago is a big city that should be affordable to all, and housing is a human right. So want to thank you all for being on the call today. Thank you to your organizations for all the amazing work that you do. I'm going to hand it over to Caitlin so we can wrap up and for folks to be able to stay engaged.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Emily, Angela, Tiff. Great conversation. I agree. It's hard to have to close it out, but we really appreciate all of you sticking with us today. There's no blueprint, no perfect way to do this, but to address these complex and challenging times. But we know that we all need to do something, right? And so some suggestions. The QR code on the screen will take you to United Way's website where you can learn more about our work. Support us through a financial gift if you'd like, or sign up to receive our newsletter so you can stay in the know regarding events like these and other things going on. We'd also recommend investing locally by shopping and supporting some of our neighborhood network communities using your economic power. I'll note that we do have an upcoming conversation for our virtual Martin Luther King Day celebration. This event is free and open to the public, and our conversation this year will focus on solidarity between Black and Latinx communities in Chicago. So you can scan the QR code here, visit our website to learn more and register. Thank you all again. Please be on the lookout for our next State of the Social Safety Net convening sometime in the new year. And I hope you all enjoy a safe and happy holiday season and Happy New Year. Thank you.